this episode, we start to cover chapter 6 of Don Quixote, which is the chapter before he meets Sancho Panza. I was wrong in preparing in my message as we prepared this. But to start off this chapter, chapter 6 of Don Quixote, does one of you want to give me a brief synopsis of the events? It's not the most eventful chapter of all. It's an interesting one, but not a lot happens. Tudor, maybe you give us some nice synopses. So I'm
So
depending on you here.
to basically summarize this chapter, it's focused around um, it's basically focused around this idea of um, what is the cause, in a way, of Don Quixote's madness.
Yeah,
So he's just arrived home in the previous chapter, and now he was quite hurt. So he just said at the end, I think he ended up just saying he just needs to eat and rest. So he went to bed. And then the plan was, from the curate's side, was that the other friend, the barber,
yeah,
Don Quixote, they would meet in the morning, and they would go through Don Quixote's books to see what sort of present that could have like led him to his current state, but also then how to um, prevent him from being affected further once he recovers. So the chapter just focuses around specifically their interaction, um, around discussing, okay, which books are worth and not worth keeping. And there's also some sort of discussion because there was a suggestion from the housekeeper when she let them into the room with books, to sort of burn the books that weren't valuable. So it's an interesting chapter because not only does it consider like the books themselves, but it also reflects on how the barber and how the curate see those books, right?
yes,
And how they believe them to be like, this is an important book, this is not so important book. But sometimes they discuss things more around like the writing style, what the book documents, the book's authors. And I think it's quite interesting because then they begin off, so summary short, they begin with this idea of books around like story of like narrative, and then they end off with books around poetry. Um, and there's also this sort of interesting like distinction there of like how they treat the books and about what ways of writing or subject matter have certain levels of importance.
yeah,
So that's basically the chapter, and it just ends off, I think, with them being quite tired and just trying to get rid of as many books at the end without having time to process book by book. Yeah.
yes, exactly. It's the chapter of literary analysis. Kia, before I add anything to that, what are your thoughts? What if you were to sort of give your summarize what this chapter is about in a sentence or two? What would that be?
Um, I think uh, like a group just like the curate wants to burn books based on morality and then they kind of evaluate them not based on morality.
I thought that was
Um,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
Sorry,
think
was there something more you wanted to say? Continue.
um yeah, I guess the semicolon after that was that they seemed to have a lot of fun doing it. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think that would be my sentence.
exactly. I think you touch on that point there, which is that this isn't a so there seems to be a moral concern initially, and we're obviously saying moral in a much broader sense than it's come to mean. We mean that's moral in the sense of also what is mentally healthy, right? Because they're trying to take away the source of Don Quixote's madness. And as you say, then it devolves, or maybe it evolves into a discussion on literary merit, which is very humorous, I think. And there are lots of very funny things. I love there are some brilliant moments of understated humor here. So if I go to one of my favorite parts to the right, for anyone watching, I have here the Centro Virtual Cervantes's version of the of the book itself. This is chapter 6, and there's a brilliant part where they refer to one of the books, patiently waiting the fire. I just thought that the way it's written, the prose is it's very understated but very humorous. I think it's the first book that is thrown into the fire, which is, if I check here, okay, so they keep Amadis de Gaula for its literary merits. It's interesting here, by the way, that the curate, the priest, wants to burn the book initially. So he seems to be taking quite a hard line. They want to eliminate almost everything here. And then the barber disagrees with him and says, well, this book has a lot of literary merit. And then the priest sort of says, okay, well, okay, we'll keep it then. And then they move on to the next one, which is Las Sergas de Esplandian, which is all about the son of Amadis de Gaula. So if we ever thought that, kind of that cheesy, the son of Rambo, Rambo 4 kind of trope is anything new, chivalric romance proves us incorrect, because we see that there's this book written about Amadis de Gaula's son. And then it says here, yes, el bueno de Esplandián fue volando al corral, esperando con toda paciencia el fuego que le amenazaba. Waiting with all patience the fire that threatened it. I just thought was very funny. It was thrown down. It went flying to the patio, waiting with all patience the fire that menaced it. That's a sort of a comment more on the style of the humor in this chapter. But yes, you're absolutely right. Going back to your point, Kier, this is something that starts out with quite a defined, quite rigorous, rigid purpose, and it becomes this commentary on literature generally. They also seem to approach everything with the assumption that they're going to burn everything. They seem to approach this library with the assumption that everything's going into the fire. And then I think the moment that we see that plan gets derailed is when, I'm trying to see exactly here when it is. Yes, I think it's more the idea is they're going to look at everything and see those few that don't deserve to be thrown into the fire, as opposed to rather, look for the books that are the exception, that should be condemned. One of the things that I have a question about in this chapter is, are all these books things that are going to come up in the rest of Don Quixote? And I know some of you have read ahead. But what I've certainly seen is that almost all of the genres that are made explicit reference to here appear later in Don Quixote in some form or another. So we see later they talk about a pastoral romance, and I'm not sure exactly when that is. I can't remember precisely which line it is, but they mention one of the pastoral romances, and one of the chapters that follows on quite soon after this is Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. They encounter two young people who are essentially living in a pastoral romance. And we see that as the rest of this epic unfolds, almost every genre of literature is accounted for and almost enacted in the story. Because there is this idea that Don Quixote is the compendium of all literature, that Cervantes sought in writing Don Quixote to take everything that can be written down and squish it into one book. And this chapter seems a microcosm of that whole project. Don't know if any of you have any thoughts about that, because there's a powerful counterpoint I'd like to bring up in a moment.
No, I didn't think explicitly about that, but I think that's actually quite true in that it's sort of a reference point, right, for the narrative that's going to unfold. So in the same way, it's giving a critique through these characters of these different stories, but at the same time, I'm curious to see actually, because I never thought of it in that lens, but I think you could probably do like an analysis maybe to see like what is burnt and what isn't burnt, and like what is present later on in the narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. It was a book about poetry towards the end, I think, when they were speaking about the pastoral romance, because there was the notion that like originally it was like, okay, the poems don't need to be burned. But then Don Quixote's niece was saying that, oh, but like if we don't try deal with all the books, then instead of wanting to be a knight, he's going to want to uh embark on like traveling like through the forest with the sheep and stuff,
And
so
and that's what he tries to do later on. So this
yeah,
doesn't. This is also really
yeah,
fascinating. I don't
yeah.
think this is in part one, but in part two. In part in part one, they come across the two young people, and I'm trying to remember their names. I'm annoyed with myself that I forget their names. But in part two, they come across on their way to Barcelona. They come across people living in almost like a pastoral romance, and then Don Quixote is sorely tempted to start living that lifestyle as well. So he's, to say the least, a very impressionable person, as a very impressionable character. Kia, anything on this point that you'd like to bring up?
I think there was just like because it's such a referential piece, there was a clear purpose in it, and I really was hoping that like we'd get a sense of each section, and like if you could like tabulate them and be like, oh, this is what got burnt and what didn't get burnt. If you say that is what ends up happening, it would be interesting to see like the commentary that is being made with that. But yeah, it was more a question than a comment.
Yeah. Because, as you say, if we find out that all the books that are burnt are treated in some those genres, the genres they belong to are treated in some negative fashion in the subsequent chapters in the story, and then those that are not burnt are treated in some positive fashion, then there's this very clear linear one-to-one relationship, a set of conclusions that we can arrive to, uh, based on what Cervantes must likely think about these genres. So that's particularly interesting. Now, the interesting counterpoint that I want to bring on here is that, as Roberto González Echeverría mentions in his lectures on this, there was a famous Spanish academic, I think it was Ramón Menéndez Pidal, or it was Menéndez Pelayo, because I always get those two confused, who, through philological analysis of Don Quixote, concluded that this was actually meant to be the end of the book. That Don Quixote was a sort of long short story, a long novella, and it was going to finish in this at this part with the burning of the books. And then Cervantes decided to continue. And as I said, if you look at Spanish editions of Don Quixote, there is obviously book one and book two, and that's the division everyone's familiar with within Don Quixote. But then within book one itself, they usually have about 4 to 5 parts, I think. I can't remember if it's four or five, but there's at least four. And this is the end of part one, I think, or part two. I can't remember. But this is like an interior division within book one. And Menéndez Pelayo or Menéndez Pidal concludes that the story was meant to end here. And so if the story was meant to end here, then it indicates that maybe Cervantes didn't write this with the intent to kind of replicate everything, all of the genres later in the story. But then rather what happened was he wrote it, he thought that he would conclude it here. Upon reflection, he decided to continue the story, and then as he continued the story, incorporate all these genres. Because we do see a lot of these, we do genuinely see a lot of these genres replicated across the course of the novels unfolding. Now, there is something particularly I want to bring up here. We'll notice here the part that I've come up to. They've gone through tons of books, okay? And if I'm not mistaken, there's this funny sort of pattern where the first few books, so they save Amadis de Gaula, then they decide to burn most of the following ones, and then they become a bit more lenient, and then we see them accepting and keeping many of the volumes. One of the volumes that they discuss towards the end is this one. They're starting to focus a lot more on the authors towards the end. And one of them, of course, there's an author right here, right? La Galatea de Miguel de Cervantes. Your thoughts on this, Tudor? Is this a
I think
self-insert? Is this the first self-insert novel? in
He's
history.
busy promoting his books, while you're reading the story to say, hey, maybe I wrote another one. You can read it.
Sort of like we're going to do in this YouTube video where we put a little card above, right? To get people to watch.
Yeah, I think what's interesting though is because I feel like this ties to your previous point, right? Around this idea of like the ending of a story. So I think here there's this idea of like the curator saying like, oh, this is a friend of mine, what, and even though like you're sort of known for not finishing a story, there's going to be more that comes afterwards. So until we get that second like part, or like we get this additional information, then we can know, okay, is this worth burning or not? You know?
Yeah,
So I think it's interesting that it like contrasts this idea of like if this was the end, maybe this wasn't a story worth having, but then like if there's more that comes after, then the story then has value, you know?
yeah,
And I think it's interesting because then it also plays around the idea of like an end where you can't necessarily draw such a like concrete conclusion about something if you
yeah,
feel that it hasn't reached its end yet.
exactly. Yeah,
And that's why they spare the book. But
yeah,
but there's definitely some bias about why he decided to spare his own book in the
yeah.
story.
That is funny. And then this is also not the last time we're going to see this technique applied.
Yeah.
In part two, there's this brilliant moment, maybe at the end of part one, but I believe it's part two. Either way, many chapters later, there is a moment when Cervantes quite geniusly interpolates another novel that he's written within a chapter of Don Quixote. And that part is one of my favorite examples of this technique, the mise en abîme, sort of the placing of one story, kind of interlocking one story within another. And you get this sort of really interesting kaleidoscope narrative going on there. Very much a feature of early modern art in general, both written and painted and portrayed even in architecture. Kia, Miguel de Cervantes's self-promotion here. What are your well? Is firstly, it may not is it a self-promotion? Maybe I don't expect you to answer that, but what are your thoughts in general about what he's doing here?
Um, I mean, this is just like a thought I had now, and I just kind of thought it was like a weird way to start versus like to sort of end off the chapter is like the first book that gets burnt is like a sequel,
Interesting.
and the last book that gets like saved is saved in virtue of the possibility of the sequel.
Yeah,
Um, which I think that there is like this interesting thing about reference there, um, and iterations in terms of like the self-referential. Um, I'm not really sure, but it does feel like a potential self-critique because of that, like the intentional kind of irony, the thing like what books do deserve to be burned, and obviously all authors think that their books are sort of worthy to be read, and whether or not that's decided, it could be an invocation for you to decide whether or not the book should be burnt, and that sort of cockiness within it.
yes. I think both points are brilliant there. I'll start with the second because, of course, Cervantes didn't meet an enormous amount of success early on in his life. He was born in the 1540s, if I'm not mistaken, and this book is published in 1605. So he was about 60 something years old at the time. And in early modern Europe, then that was relatively old. That was much older than we would consider it today. So he'd lived most of his life without meeting much success in much literary success. So he's maybe also extremely self-critical. He would have had a lot of time to reflect on why he just didn't see the success that he saw some of his contemporaries, notably Lope de Vega, achieve during their lifetime. And Lope de Vega was younger than Cervantes and was far more successful, far more prolific as well. So there's this potential self-critique as well. Also, of course, there's this very torrid history of sequels that Don Quixote had, right? We know that this book was published, Cervantes seems to have decided to leave it as it is, and then he was so disappointed at the Avellaneda sequel that he decided to write a sequel in which Don Quixote dies so no one could possibly write a sequel afterwards. And that touches us, well, that brings us, allows us to touch upon another really interesting point, which is, when does a story finish? When is the final chapter, and when is the last word on anything? And I wonder if that's also being contemplated here. Is You were right in saying that we can only judge the story after it's reached its conclusion. But when does the story reach its conclusion? And I mean, this is one of the problems we're facing in a lot of media today, is that it's so easy to produce sequels on things, and it's very, even for, I think, the careful, sensitive reader. When we read something really beautiful, we watch something truly amazing, we don't want a sequel, but also at the same time, we want something more, right? We understand that there's a way the sequel can kind of dilute, and it can cheapen the original, but at the same time, the thing is so profound. What you've watched or what you've read is so profound that you want to live within it more, right? And as I said, I think there are two sort of ways you can resolve that internal discomfort, that internal conflict. Understand that the book must be as it is, or the work must be as it is, and we cannot expand on it. Or you can go all the way and try expand on it. Sometimes that works, often it doesn't, right? So it's interesting that's just a factor that's going to come across this whole literary project of Don Quixote, is finding the right ending and not having this perpetual ongoing cycle of chivalric romances, which was the norm. I think just an example of this is in the first page of this particular edition I have here that covers this chapter. We see something close to, I think there's reference to something close to like 7 different Amadis stories, you know. So that's that is something that he's grappling with. There's a dichotomy here between stories that have a finish, have a proper end, and stories that just continuously they go on and on and on. Any thoughts about that?
It's interesting with this. In like with the first story they speak about is that because it's the first, it's what's kept. Um,
Yes.
so I think it's a very subjective thing. Like even in their discussion, you can see they don't necessarily align between them, and you can see that although they were trying to do that from an informed place, like often the reader is the one who decides when something finishes.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's interesting. I did.
Yeah. Kia, anything to say there, or should we move on to another point?
I did have a thought.
Please go ahead.
So I guess there's this throughout like the chapter, there's this feeling of like, okay, well, why does a book deserve to be burnt? And like what effect does it have on the reader, whether or not it be moral or whether or not it just be bad for like literary sake. And so like there's like a sense of like what is the purpose of the story? And I guess the potential answer being like is the end of the story when the purpose is complete.
Yeah.
Um and I suppose there's like this reference to poetry as well, like um this whole sense of like how dangerous literature can be with like a reference to poetry and poetry being censored and its effect on people. And so like I guess when there's the banning of sequels, there's a sense that that purpose has already been fulfilled. And so if it's not doing something new, then it's doesn't have a purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Um,
that's, sorry, I'm not cutting you off, I hope.
no, no.
Yeah. I think that's a brilliant way of seeing it. That's not actually just a good way of analyzing this section. It's a good way of analyzing all literary works and all works of film and television as well. Is, has the series, has the book fulfilled its purpose? That I think is actually quite That's quite a useful way of thinking about it that I haven't thought of before. Maybe it's something we err away from because we want to be quite cautious in determining what the purpose of a particular book or work is. Often we can look at what the author says, but as we know, the way there's something curious about narrative, which is that it sort of quite quickly escapes the capacities of the author, right? It often the book itself is more imaginative than the author himself or herself is, and this often is the case. It's not simply that the book takes on a new meaning because readers imbue it with new meaning. It just seems to like, in and of itself, tie into a whole series of problems and patterns that the original author may have even been unaware of, right? So we've always got this problem of author's intent. But that doesn't mean that we can't try and discern what the purpose of a particular work is. So I think that's a very good way of looking at it. Now that you mention this, though, we've spoken about this before. Don Quixote, the character, is a Platonic figure, right? So he's motivated by these forms, these ideals. He lives in this world of quite clear, absolute moral ideals that can be followed and aspired after. Sancho Panza, who we'll meet later, I think is an Aristotelian figure, and I don't think that this is a coincidence that we have an Aristotelian and a Platonic figure walking together. That will come later. So this whole that storied relationship between Plato and poetry, which I think is much more complex than we conventionally see. I don't think Plato, for example, is as against poetry as he says he is, or rather as Socrates says he is in the Republic. That's a different question we can address another time. But it's certainly clear that explicitly Plato condemns poetry in the Republic. Is the condemnation of poetry in this realm of the books a reflection of Platonic thought? Perhaps. That's something I think is quite interesting. There's something else I want to bring in here, which is that we've just spoken about poetry and chivalric romance. Those are representative. Those are represented, sorry. But we do see that the strange thing about Don Quixote's library is, even though it's very large, it's said here, for example, so, y hallaron más de 100 cuerpos de libros grandes, muy bien encuadernados, y otros pequeños. And so this is 100. They found 100 large corpuses, large books, and another few small ones. This is a very large library for the time. The notes by Francisco Rico Talas. So by the standards of the time, that's an enormous library. But the very strange thing is that this isn't particularly representative of literature. Roberto González Echeverría comments on this quite a bit. But we see lots of chivalric romance. We see a bit of poetry. We don't see other genres of literature. We don't see histories here. We do see a few epics, but no histories, no devotional literature either. And keep in mind that even in the 1600s, by far the most popular genre of literature was hagiography, lives of saints, and lives of holy persons. We don't see any of that in Cervantes' library. Now, there are some who've concluded from that Cervantes, sorry, Don Quixote's library, that Don Quixote is a kind of humanist. I think that might be the case, but then the big problem is that there's no classical literature either, and a humanist would definitely have classical literature. There would definitely be Cicero, there would definitely be perhaps Marcus Aurelius, but we don't see any of that. No Ovid, no Aeneid here at all. So I don't think the answer is really that Don Quixote is meant to be some kind of humanist here. I think there's something else there. But before I give my conjecture here, the lack of like representative body on literature, what do you think it's saying, Tudor?
I think there's an interesting I think there's an interesting approach of like what can be critiqued and what can't be critiqued. Um, for me, I think I was like quite surprised within this chapter, specifically around this idea of like religious texts. So they only engage with it like from the title of one story where the curist is saying like, oh, because they like mention the cross, then it should be preserved, but like behind the cross there's the devil, so send it to the fire.
Yes.
Um, so I think I'm not so aware. I think you could delve more into like the practices at the time, but I think there's an engagement of like these fiction stories, these like fictive stories. Like the curse refers to them sort of some of them like to be spared because they're for entertainment, right?
Hmm.
But at the same time, when they're considering like, oh, this book, we almost burnt this book, and like we really shouldn't have burnt this book because it's like such an amazing story because it speaks about this and this and this. You can see they're like very engrossed in terms of like what's present. So I think it's sort of, I would say, more focus on like these are the kinds of books we can discuss whether they have merit or not, whereas the others aren't necessarily the case. I think that's from the author's perspective. When it comes more in terms of Don Quixote, um, I think the thing is around like Don Quixote and also like his madness, there's this idea of like living through fictive fictional stories,
Hmm.
right? Where we understand like life and our relationship to others and our purpose of what we do in relation to these like fictional stories where they allow us to aspire to certain things. So I think that's probably why, in a sense, they didn't necessarily focus, like Don Quixote wouldn't want to have necessarily other books, because if it's Don Quixote is trying to be a saint, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a very different narrative and also how it's understood in terms of like, oh, this person is trying to be a saint. I didn't think you would have that same approach of saying, okay, this person is acting crazy, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
with it's I think a more nuanced discussion as well, in terms of the kinds of things that happen within like those stories as well when discussing saints, right? I think
Yeah.
if you remove that purpose of like focusing like on a divine figure or things related to that, then they won't necessarily receive as much critique. Um,
Yeah.
and I think more so at that time. I think you can elaborate more on the history.
Yeah, I
But
think that's actually a good point, which is that he probably, if he were trying to imitate, well, then maybe this is also another thing, which is that then also the difference is that it's very clear that these hagiographical books, I think, I may be wrong, might consult with an expert, but these hagiography is meant to be imitated, whereas it's really a question if the chivalric romance ought to be imitated literally, right? Uh, or or at least the idea with the hagiographical work is that you take the principles you read about and you apply them in your own life, whereas the relationship between what we should do and what we read when we're talking about chivalric romance, for us that would be superhero stories, or just actually by and large the majority of the fiction that we consume these days. We probably wouldn't say if we tried to articulate kind of some kind of relationship of mimesis, of kind of imitating what we see, we would have to very carefully construct a theory so that we don't go out pretending we're Iron Man, right? So I think there's also this difference of how things are meant to be imitated. How do you apply the principles of what you're reading into your life? And that changes according to the kind of genre we're reading here. Kia, any thoughts from your side on this question of how limited Don Quixote's library is in terms of its literary representation?
Um, I haven't thought about it a lot. I'm kind of musing about it, so I think I'll just wait and see. I mean, it's obviously representative of him. Um, and there's like a sense of unreality. It is like odd that there's not a lot of religious texts given the times. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
I think something that interests me here is that one thing we've touched upon quite a lot is this idea that reading is dangerous. And reading is dangerous. It is, right? This is why Don Quixote is so important to anyone in any time. We're reading today more than we ever have before. And we're reading things in a very rapid format. And we know with the rise of fake news, right? We know with like the rise of crazy conspiracy theories that your capacity to read can actually lead you into some quite serious trouble. So reading is dangerous. But maybe what's being said here is that it depends on what you read as well, right? Maybe the issue is that Don Quixote isn't just mad because he reads a lot. He's mad because he reads a lot of one thing. He doesn't read broadly. He's not well read in the sense that we would use that term today. He's only reading chivalric romance, and if your whole relationship to reality is dictated by chivalric romance, then maybe you would think that the world really is a lot more like a romance of Arthur, right? This is one of the reasons why I think why it's relevant that we don't see history books here at all. This also after the time that Spain had some very prominent, very important historians like Juan de Mariana, who were chronicling this very dramatic transition from Spain being really a set of separate Christian kingdoms, then to becoming the most powerful empire seen since the fall of Rome, or maybe seen since the fall of some of the more powerful caliphates. This is significant, I think, that we don't see Don Quixote engaging with other forms of literature. So that was sort of what I wanted to finish off. I'm going to enter very quickly in our last few minutes into rapid essay mode because we need to address the elephant in the room, which is that this is very clearly a reference to the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. And I think that certainly is the case. But when we do this, we have to think, well, it's a reference to the Spanish Inquisition, such as Miguel de Cervantes would have seen the Spanish Inquisition. And so here it's relevant to bring up some major changes, major shifts in the historiography of the Spanish Inquisition to get an idea of what Cervantes is talking about here. Because what's very significant here is that the priest and the curate, the priest and the barber are quite humorous figures, but they don't come across at all as sinister figures in any way. And they come across a lot more like, they come across a lot more sort of like policemen do in some popular American fiction, right? Figures of ridicule, actually also especially English fiction, one might say, figures of ridicule that have a certain degree of authority. Now, in the 1960s, I think this was 1961, Henry Kamen, who is a prominent Spanish, well, he's English, but he's British, but he's a historian of Spain, released a book, The Inquisition, or a Historical Revision. And that, since the 1960s, has been through about 6 editions. It might even be on its 7th as we speak, and completely changed the way that historians see the Inquisition. So before, the vision that historians had was very much an Enlightenment vision of the Inquisition, a vision that sees the Inquisition as the absolute antithesis of everything modern and everything that we uphold as good in modern society. And this was an idea that was very prominent amongst French Enlightenment thinkers. And that's the idea that's really settled into popular culture. What Kamen in the 1960s came out against was, Kamen came out against this in the 1960s and essentially argued, if I were to boil down his large book into a few sentences, essentially argued that the Inquisition was a system, was an institution that hardly affected even literary figures' lives. So the average person would have had very little to do with the Inquisition. And especially in the countryside, like La Mancha, would almost never have interacted at all with the Inquisition. It was largely, in Kamen's view, an ineffectual institution. He doesn't think that it really had much influence on Spanish society at all. And of course, part of this this is that now the question that of course people will come up to is, well then what about all these indexes of forbidden books and book burnings? And the simple answer is that firstly, what Kamen argues is that these book burnings were actually very rare. And then secondly, indexes of forbidden books were never enforced, or they were very rarely enforced. So books would often actually a lot like what the priest and the barber are doing here. They would on an almost arbitrary level be put onto this, put on or not put onto the list of the index. And but they would not be enforced. So you wouldn't have a case where people would go around to printing houses and check that they were actually following these at all. And one of the reasons that that is relevant is that this is a continuous theme, or it's a present tension in this story. The difference between legislation and enforcement, which was a common problem in Spain at the time and in the Spanish Empire at the time. And there are even popular sayings that go to that more or less can be summarized as it is legally mandated, but it is ignored. I can't remember the exact Spanish saying for that. So having said all of this, this doesn't mean that we have to absolutely agree with Kamen, but given that he's sort of the seminal figure in Inquisition studies, I think it's fair to at least take his argument very seriously here. And that means that we can then get sort of an idea as to why Cervantes why this is such a sort of a humorous moment in the book for Cervantes. Whereas today, and I think especially after what we've seen in World War II, we wouldn't really write humorously about this idea of burning books, right? Because there's such a repugnant cultural image associated with book burnings as they happen in the early 20th century, right? Because of the ideology that was associated with them. I think that kind of helps us jump the historical cognitive gap. But after I've introduced this kind of mammoth of a sort of an elephant in the room, it's probably a mammoth in the room. Any thoughts on that, Tudor or Kier? Because that is, I mean, it goes without saying that that's a fairly controversial part of the book in a sense, or it's a fairly controversial, evident reference from our perspective.
I think what stood out for me in terms of like the chapter itself and where it made reference to was this idea of the way the priest, right, or the curate was describing books. Sometimes it would be like an inverse, right? It'd be like this book is like so bad because of this and this, and but it's like it's so good, right? So because it's like dealing with all of these things, it's like so good. So rather than like burning it or leaving it here, you take it home with you and you keep it, right? You would say. So I think what's interesting is that specifically around like books and being burned is that there's always this notion of access, right? So in this case, like at the time, I think as well, there's this idea of like the general people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who have access, so like Don Quixote, and being someone then who shouldn't have access to certain books because they're
Yes.
going to get affected by them, right? And other people who maybe know a bit better, so like the priest, for example, or like um the barber is like you're someone that okay, you're reasonable, you have reasonable mind, you can keep these books even though maybe you shouldn't have them, right? And I think that's sort of the notion that it's playing around with. Um, I think what's interesting, I don't know how much time there is, but I was attending like a conference about a year ago, and I think it's quite interesting where there's been I would say in modern times, there's been a very big push to not get rid of books,
Yes.
no
Yeah.
matter how like bad they may be, right? And I think what was interesting is it was at a conference, there was a presentation of it was like a small library. I'm not sure exactly where in Germany. Um, but then the librarians had an issue, right? Because a lot of their storage space was being used to like store historical things like related from like World War II, right?
Yeah,
But these aren't books that they're giving people to read. They're not things that people have access to unless they like come from a university for some research purposes, or like there's some sort of system through which you gain access to know that these books are at this library, right? But people are storing and sort of documenting it because it's seen as part of like history,
yeah,
right? But sometimes like the librarian says like, some of these books you have them, but like to be honest, if you could, you would rather just like get rid of them because you're
yeah,
spending money like storing and preserving certain books that maybe don't have value. Like maybe you should only have certain books within that period that like have value because in a way you could say like how useful could it be to have like books with like racial prejudice in terms of like every type of aspect, where if you just have a few monumental books, you kind of get the idea, of what's going on. So I think there's always a dichotomy of like preserving what's there, but at the same time, who gets to preserve it, who gets access to what is preserved, and sometimes we have we have importance and we place like actual value of money being spent to preserve things that maybe could have also been used to like create other books that are maybe more beneficial for the
yeah.
society. So yeah, that's a quick.
No, no, I think it's brilliant. I mean, I agree entirely. There is this fundamental tension. The more you come to know, the more you realize knowledge is dangerous, and ignorance to some degree is bliss, which is why we've got all these mythological, sort of symbolic references. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a great example of that, right? Uh, it seems repressive to say something like there are some things that actually some people just shouldn't know, and it seems conspiratorial to do so. But human experience shows us that given certain information, some people will reach conclusions that are very dangerous, right? That can be very dangerous to society. Kia, anything you want to say there to finish us off here?
I think it's just like it's a very stock image. I think like I really enjoy the embodiment of the image of like, yeah, they're burning books now, but then there's the sense that they've burned books before, and then there's this like very stark absence if you're thinking about that, and just like how embodied that feels, I guess, within the story. Um, in terms of like displaying the consequences of censorship, not having that ability to have it influence a person.
Yeah.
Um, but that's sort of all I have.
Yeah, I think we I mean this is a moment of censorship, right, in the book, and it does touch upon this serious problem of censorship, which is that, I mean, in my opinion, censorship always does exist. I don't think there's really ever such a thing as free speech. It just doesn't. I don't think a society can really sustain that in a radical sense. Maybe to some moderated sense, yes, but there will always be a form of censorship, be it explicit or be it implicit in any society, and that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just an inevitable thing. So that in itself is actually a discussion that I would have loved to have more time to go over. But I'm certain that given the cyclical nature of this book, we will have a chance to discuss it later in another chapter when it's doubtless brought forth. Unless any of you have any comments, I think we can finish off today's session here. Thank you very much for your time. But before I say goodbye, any last comments from either of you? No, perfect. Thank you very much for discussing this book with me. And for anyone watching, thank you very much for listening to us discuss this book. You are welcome to join us and read this book with us. You'll find a link in the description below to join our club. And thank you once again, and I will see you all at our next session.